When Nyerere returned to Tanganyika in 1952, colonial unrest had spread across the continent. To the north, Kenya was engulfed in the violent Mau Mau rebellion. Tanganyika was much quieter, but talk of independence was in the air. Nyerere took a job as a teacher, but he found his true calling in politics. He soon remade an old social club into his country's first political party. As the party attracted thousands of followers across the nation, Nyerere kept the title of his old profession, Mwalimu, Swahili for teacher. In 1961, Tanganyika finally won its independence from Britain. At midnight on December 9th, the Tanganyikan flag flew for the first time. The next year, the country swore in Julius Nyerere as its first president. He had been elected with more than 98% of the vote. Nyerere set out to slay the three dragons that plagued his country: ignorance, poverty, and disease. His weapon would be socialism, fused with the ancient tribal customs of Africa. The word he used to describe it was ujamaa, Swahili for familyhood.
What my father believed in socialism, the way I understand it, is that right after independence, most Tanzanians were uneducated and were not all that wealthy. So we had to move together.
Rosemary Nyerere was born in the same year her father led the country to independence. She is now a member of parliament herself.
Mwalimu used to say that it's not new because that's how we live. You go to a typical Tanzanian village, a typical African village. We don't have these nuclear families, just the mother and the father and the children. We have lots of people living around. We help each other. So it's not really new.
By 1967, Tanganyika had merged with the island of Zanzibar to become Tanzania. Nyerere had been advocating his brand of African socialism for more than 4 years, but he had not imposed it on the country. He now decided to write it into law. Nyerere laid out his roadmap to socialism in a speech that became known as the Arusha Declaration.
This was a declaration, as it said, not just for Tanzania, but for all of Africa, and indeed other Africans did look upon it that way because it was the most complete, most ambitious attempt to create a kind of communist manifesto for Africa.
Nyerere nationalized the banks and major industries, promising to give workers control of the means of production. And foreign investments would be turned away in the name of self-reliance. According to Nyerere, socialism would now pave the way to true independence.
The declaration, when it came out, spelled out so many things, a certain kind of utopia. There was this feeling that alongside economic development, you created a new human being. It was a whole new idea that talked about caring for the next fellow. That was an exciting period.
Nyerere encouraged Tanzanians to reorganize their communities into collectives he called ujamaa villages. These new villages would build socialism, and they would also provide access to schools, hospitals, and water. Across the harbor from the capital city of Dar es Salaam, Gesalole became an Ujamaa village in 1971.
After Mwalimu Nyerere encouraged us to form Ujamaa villages, we were the first to respond and make our village an Ujamaa village. After we began leading the Ujamaa way of life, we were able to get facilities for keeping poultry, fishing. See that boat over there? We didn't have it before. We got it with our own initiative, and we made progress.
Nyerere's vision of African socialism won the admiration of many in the West. As the Cold War intensified, many saw it as the best alternative to Soviet-style communism in the Third World. Support, both moral and financial, poured in.
World Bank presidents would fly out, heads of donor agencies would fly out, students would come to spend a half a year or a year at the University of Dar es Salaam. The University of Dar es Salaam was a great place in the mid-1960s and early 70s. This was seen as a serious, well-reasoned attempt at socialism, and the feeling was, let's support this experiment.
Talk of socialism's potential in the Third World came amid disappointments in Europe. In places like Great Britain, pensions and socialized medicine continued to enjoy broad support. But state planning had not delivered on its promise.
There's a tension between Britain in the 1960s. On the one hand, we have the image of the swinging 60s, the world of the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the world of Carnaby Street. The problem was that the kind of creative energy that you saw going into music and clothing didn't go into most parts of the British economy.
There was suddenly this color and efflorescence, but what it concealed was the fact that the economy was essentially dying. And we're living on the credit of the past, on old declining, rusting industries like coal mining, shipbuilding, and steel. And nobody knows where the money's going to come from now on. So it was a kind of fool's paradise.
In 1971, the Times of London called the country's condition the British disease.
The problem with the welfare state was not that it wanted to distribute goods to the people of England. The problem was that a society bent on questions of distribution, bent on questions of consumption, was not a society that was going to deal with the underlying economic problems of how you produce enough, how you produce efficiently, how you compete in a global market. And that's the imbalance.
The world was changing, and it seemed that British industry simply couldn't keep up. Laws designed to protect British workers now prevented management from changing old practices. Workers demanded and won ever higher wages, even as productivity stagnated. In 1975, inflation hit 24%.
What essentially happened was that the wage settlements, as they became higher, pushed inflation higher. And that leads to an inflation